should we have predicted that this would have happened? Well, interestingly, the answer is yes, at least if you are an adherent to what is probably the best established theory of international trade that economics has, which is the theory of comparative advantage. This is a theory which goes back literally hundreds of years, first developed in reasonably modern form by David Ricardo, and it's, as economic theories go, a very successful one. That is, it has done very well empirically in explaining international patterns of trade in many circumstances, in many historical periods. But the theory of comparative advantage makes the prediction that an increase in trade, an increase in globalization, should reduce inequality in poor countries. And I want to spend some time on why it makes that prediction, the argument behind this prediction. So the theory of comparative advantage is based on the idea that the reason why countries trade with one another is because they differ in their relative endowments of the factors of production. That is, they are endowed with different inputs or different proportions of inputs. And for at least this first part of my talk, I want to simplify matters, and I'll suppose that there are just two kinds of inputs. There's high-skilled labor, workers who have a lot of training, a lot of education, and low-skilled labor, workers who don't have the benefit of this training. And what I want to do is to compare a rich country with a poor country. So again, to simplify matters, I'll suppose that there are just two countries in question, one rich, one poor. The reason why the rich country is rich, at least according to the theory, is because it has a higher proportion of high-skilled workers. The wealth of the country is intimately tied to the human capital of its population. So a rich country will have a higher proportion of high-skilled workers, and that means, from the standpoint of the theory, that it has a comparative advantage. It is in a better position than the poor country to produce goods which require a lot of high-skilled workers. So to make matters simple, let's look at a good like computer software. Computer software is a good which is produced almost entirely by high-skilled workers and software engineers. By contrast, the poor country has a comparative advantage in producing goods where training and skill don't matter so much. So let's take an agricultural product like rice. And to see the effect that globalization, that trade, has on inequality in production, let's do a thought experiment. Let's look at production patterns and wage patterns in the two countries before trade opens up between them. And let's compare that to the production patterns and wage patterns after globalization occurs. That is, after the trade barriers between the two countries come down. And the difference between the two can be attributed to globalization. So what happens before globalization? Well, we're supposing that there are just these two countries and there are the two goods, computer software and rice. Now, before trade between the two countries becomes possible, if consumers in the rich country want to consume both software and rice, it's going to be necessary for companies in the rich country to produce both of these goods. And similarly in the poor country. So the rich country is going to produce both software and rice, and the poor country is going to produce both software and rice. But there's a sense in which producing software in the poor country is an inefficient use of the labor force. Why do I say that? Because the poor country has a lot of unskilled workers. And because of the nature of rice, these workers are better able to produce rice than they are software. And so there's a sense in which low-skilled workers are actually hurt by the production of software in the poor country, to the extent that production in the poor country is being diverted away from rice and being diverted toward software. This is not good for the low-skilled workers because they're not needed very much for software. So if there's more software and less rice being produced, that means that the demand for low-skill labor is lower than it would have been had the labor force been entirely devoted to rice production. So that means that wages of low-skilled workers will be lower than they would have been had all of this computer software not been produced in the poor country. And similarly, because there aren't that many high-skilled workers and this software is being produced, their wages are going to be quite high because they're in short supply. The demand for their services will be elevated relative to what would have happened had the software not been produced. So that's the story before trade between the rich country and poor country becomes possible. So